hopefully everyone's been saving up their questions, and I mean, as the title suggests, it's a question and answer session, so we'd like to devote as much time as possible to questions from the floor, but also I think the panelists maybe have some questions for each other, and I certainly have some as well. So I think just to kick us off, I'm going to kick us off with a question, and really to focus on the title of the Q&A session, Dignity, Diversity and Inclusion in the Modern Workplace. It strikes me as an interesting phrasing, the modern workplace, especially when we consider the business imperative and the moral imperative for equality, diversity and inclusion, that it seems like all of these imperatives were true 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Why now do we feel like we may have special momentum around it? And is this perhaps momentum that we feel like we can believe in and sort of bank on? So maybe starting with Laura?
I do think I think you're right. There is a new momentum in this industry. It's really emerged in the last 2 or 3 years, in my view. I think there's some trickle-down effects. There've been quite a lot of reports that have hit senior management desks that produce the statistics about performance, and that really can be a massive impetus, particularly when the attitude previously had been, well, we can do equality. Mm-hmm. But that's not the same thing, and I think it's been a learning process. I mean, I certainly feel I'm still learning. I'm trying to make changes, small changes, as we go along. But it is a learning process, and I think without these sorts of discussions are what bring it to the fore. But it's getting the right people in the room, so that it is the senior leadership, and it is the middle-aged white men who are actually listening to some of this stuff too.
Great. Anyone else like to jump in on the idea? Helen?
I also think that it can't really be divorced from the social and political context. Mm-hmm. So I think there are two things. Firstly, the internet has allowed us to hear so many other voices. Twitter in particular, Twitter is a particular platform where you can hear everybody's voice. And that means that, people are becoming more aware. And secondly, in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a lot of political changes. We've got Brexit, we have Donald Trump. I think that people realise that they can't really just sit back. Yeah. And these things, if we sit back, that's what we end up with. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Actually, I had meant to mention the fact that we haven't convened a manel. I don't know if anyone is familiar with the phenomena of a manel. It was recently introduced to me, but if you're on Twitter, #manel, and you'll see many instances of male only and predominantly white only male panels, even women in STEM panels that are entirely male. So let that sink in. But sorry, Femi, would you like to talk about why now?
I think there's been a change in the people who are banging on the door of the industry. I think we've seen an increasing number of, in particular, black women, but black men too, entering and doing well at university level. So I think they're able to compete more effectively in the scholarly publishing world. I think that people have more vociferously been making the business case and actually can see the evidence for encouraging more people to be involved. And generally the whole sort of social demographic of like immigrant populations is shifting. We got loads of money now. Just doing, and a lot of us arrived here either to go to school when we had no money, or we arrived here to do the jobs which didn't pay very much money. But now we're at the next level, and we're a force to be reckoned with, and I think people are noticing that.
Brilliant. Finally, Fiona.
I agree with all the points of the fellow panellists. I think TNF's Women in Publishing group has really benefited from the timing. One of the things that we did earlier this year was talk to one of the people who set up Elsevier's Women's Network, which they did in 2009. And I know they took a lot longer to get buy-in from senior management and get things off the ground. So I think that the TNF group has benefited from all of the cultural, social, political change there.
Fantastic. Right. Well, that was the opening question. I wonder if we've already got questions from the floor that either we've been saving up for individual panellists or the entire panel.
You can say your name and where you're from.
Hi, I'm Kate from Sage. I really loved hearing what was going on here. My question is about how we take that to our global offices. Obviously, we've got things in place here to try and promote women to the upper management, to get women in IT and tech. But then I look across at our other offices, specifically our India office, and I'm thinking, how am I going to influence what's going on there? I don't know if that's the right question for here, but that's something that we're thinking about a lot.
I think it's perfectly great question. Actually, I mean, Fiona has some experience with setting up the Women in Publishing group in Philadelphia and here, so it's at least globally, so it'd be good to talk to that.
I would say that Philadelphia is not too culturally different as a start point, so it's perhaps inevitable that that's the office where there was an interest.
Will there be other chapters in the other TNF offices?
Hopefully, yes. We've had lots of requests to do things for other offices, but because of our grassroots nature and the structure of Women in Publishing, it's really difficult for us to do that. I can't get up at 3 a.m. to facilitate a session in the Melbourne office, for instance. So if there are, what we would like to do, if there is a call for it, is to help people set up their group in other global offices.
So to take sort of ownership of the challenges within their own, the other offices,
yeah,
or the demographics.
And it's definitely that the other thing is that we don't want to appear culturally homogenous. Interestingly, the Philadelphia UK offices obviously have a very different maternity and paternity policy regime, and that's one area where, when we cover parenting topics, I don't think we would open up the remote conference line, because that's something that's culturally unique to working in the UK, the UK legislation and the UK context, and to start talking about our challenges when our sisters in the US office have many more challenges around parenting with only 12 weeks unpaid leave, would perhaps achieve the opposite to what we would want to do.
Absolutely. I don't know if anyone else would like to talk. I mean, Laura, you were sort of mentioning about your global remit.
Yeah, it's slightly similar in the sense that it's the US and the UK.
Yeah.
There are different employment legislation issues, and I've attempted to unify things by bringing things closer together, but I can't. I mean, we're under EU employment law. That is very different in the States. So some of this is more about company attitude in the employment handbook, rather than trying to instigate something that wouldn't stand up in the States.
Have you learned much about because you mentioned contractors at the very, so maybe not people that are under your sort of direct management or in the structure itself, but have you learned more about interacting with the people from not just England and the US?
I mean, I think we've learned some things about cultural difference in behaviour, the way that people, interact with each other when they're asking questions or responding to things, which has been helpful and useful. Yeah. Our staff are, US and European. We have quite a few European staff. I've been learning a few little bits about hiring from them. Such as, almost unheard of in Germany not to put your photo on your CV, whereas I would never put my photo on my CV. Just little things like that that have helped with the hiring process, I think, of understanding a few differences to look at, so that we can not make those judgments that we might have made otherwise from a very UK or US standpoint.
Oh, fantastic.
It is difficult. We've tried to get the global offices as involved as possible. So we hold our meetings and our sessions at the best time to try and get everybody attending. Some of our meetings we run totally on Skype, because there can be, when you have a meeting in person and then you have various people working from home on Skype, they're often kind of left out. It can be like talking to a brick wall, and sometimes at some meetings they've even forgotten to dial them in. So we try and do kind of meetings with everybody. We also try and roll out some of the training in other areas. But I think one of the things is that not every regional office is interested. So we've been trying really hard with our China office, but it's very hard. Like, there's such a big cultural difference that we don't fully understand. Why they don't want to get involved, but I think that's also important to acknowledge.
Yeah, I'd like to say a little something about that. I've got a couple of clients. Been working with BBC Asia and Persia and a few other bits of the business, and I've got a couple of music clients who work all over the world. And it is about focusing on the similarities rather than the differences. And in particular, I found the cultural questions have been really important to tackle, because there is a universal experience of recognising that trying to challenge things across a power hierarchy, for example, that's going to be similar experience all over the place. But then there are other areas, so I was glibly talking to, I think, bits of BBC Africa talking about equality and popped LGBT in, and the whole room went completely silent. And then I realised, oh yeah, okay, so we're going to have to recognise that there are some areas where they're not going to want to focus. So I think the start, if I were going to do that again, if I was going to begin that work again, I would start with the cultural competency. I would begin with spending some time with a few people working out where there's overlaps, and just as importantly, where there are differences. And I think that lays the groundwork very well. And from there, I would say, okay, now we're going to do the work together on where there's similarity, and encourage them to do it locally where there's differences.
Well, fantastic. Hopefully that's a lot to get started with at the very least, right? Is there any other questions from the floor? Oh, there we go.
Hi, I wanted to follow up a little bit on the question about childcare and flexibility. What was said earlier reminded me of something that I've seen over the years, okay? Where it's not just the difference between US and UK policies, and things have gotten better in the US, but one of the things I've found is when you become more flexible and you allow people to deal with, the issues of childcare when they have kids and need time. One of the odd things I've seen is that sometimes other women who are childless have this horrible resentment, and that feels bad to me. I mean, I took 2 childcare leaves in the 80s when I had to come back after 6 weeks, and I don't resent what's going on now. I'm jealous, but I wonder how do you get around that? And I don't see it's the men that have a problem with it; it's other women, and that I find that really bothersome.
Laura, sorry.
I'm not sure this is going to be a helpful answer, but I don't have children. And so looking at flexibility patterns and things to do with flexibility around childcare and parental leave was something that I don't have direct experience of. So I tried to look at it objectively and try to take some of the issues out of it. Actually, some of our male staff are the ones who are going and picking the kids up from school. Or who are doing some of those activities, and that's what they need in terms of flexibility. I do think it's important that it's parental leave that you're offering, not maternity leave. Mm-hmm. And I know we have different policies and rules in the UK, but I think you can still do that in the States to try and make it more equal and give people the opportunity to choose. So I think it's difficult. I do think there is some resentment occasionally within some organisations of the people who do not have children feeling as though they end up picking up the pieces and doing more of the work because people are always off. So it's really about sharing it out and making it about flexible working, not less working. Mm-hmm. So that if people need to take time out to go to parents' evening, the school play or whatever it is, they can work at another time. It's not just that their project or part of their project gets given to somebody else. So that it's acknowledged that everybody can be flexible. It doesn't matter why. Mm-hmm. We don't make it about childcare. If somebody wants to go to the hairdressers, they can go to the hairdressers. It's about anything. It's whatever they feel they need to do with their time, at certain times, so that it's open.
If anyone had, the flexible working part, Emerald has been strong, right?
Yeah, I agree that what's made it such a success is that flexible working is for everyone. So it's not just for childcare. And yeah, if you want to go to the hairdressers and then you want to work afterwards, you go to the hairdressers and you continue work afterwards. So it's not just about childcare. It's about respecting what people's working patterns are.
It's really important that it's not just about childcare as well, because there can be I'm not sure it's the right word, the reverse discrimination there, where I do have a child, and I feel that sometimes people's perceptions of what I want to achieve out of my career are influenced by the fact that I have a child. I'm my family's breadwinner. I want to achieve everything I can possibly achieve in my career, and I don't want your perception of me to harm that possibility. Equally, I think that childless women, child-free women, childless by choice, also suffer discrimination and judgment in the workplace. And Tasha Mellons-Cohen and other people have spoken eloquently on that on Scholarly Kitchen, so I would recommend reading that.
Fantastic. Sorry, on there.
I just wanted to follow up on that. And I mean, I'm a huge proponent for flexible work, and I'm usually the one who has to stand up at these things and say, you know, if you consider remote workers, you will have a larger pool. But it's great if everyone has flexible work, but there is a sort of a different perception of someone who's leaving early on Friday because their child is in a play. And there's also a different perception between when men leave versus when women leave, because they're sort of like, he's leaving, his daughter's in a play, he's such a great dad. Like, she's leaving again, her daughter's in another play. But a recognition that there are folks who may not have a spouse or children, have parents, they have a aunt, they have a close friend, that it's different than going to the hairdresser. Taking a leave to take care of someone who's important to you but doesn't happen to be in the parent-child relationship or biologically parent-child relationship you shouldn't have to think of it as the same way as going to the hairdresser. It's equally important. So just wanted to kind of highlight that.
I think that's maybe where the modern workplace thing comes in, because people in workplaces now are dealing with the sandwich generation, caring for older relatives and younger relatives, potentially biologically connected or not.
And actually, before we hear from Laura and Helen on that side, because I know you're raring to jump in, but is there a way we can actively address the dissonance, rather than saying, so it's flexible for everyone, but actually start to address some of these things that are coming up around either resentment or that there is a value difference on how we interpret people's flexible arrangements? Is there something we actively can do about that, or is that something that will sort of work itself out?
I think you have to make statements in policy about this, not just about flexibility being a company policy across the board, that it's not just about childcare, that it's about anything to do with whether it's personal circumstances, caring for a relative, a friend, something that's happened in your life, but also choice. So it's across the board, and everybody has the same expectations, and that we're not. It's trying to remove that judgment. Yeah. It's really hard, but it's a cultural thing, and I think it comes from the top down to try and build that.
One practical thing I saw a client do was just do a few case studies on why people are working flexibly. And the ones that jumped out at me was, here is this young woman called Laura who is hoping that she will have a career in politics at some point. She's working with us now because she thinks that's a stepping stone to that. And so she works 3 days a week, and then she's working as a personal assistant to this politician at the moment. So it was a lovely little case study, which was nothing to do with childcare, but showed how flexibility worked. And there was another one where somebody was interested in design and textile and something, and was hoping to start her own business, and she working in the finance department somewhere, and again was learning about business financing, so that in 10 years' time or 15 years' time she could be her own boss. And it was lovely to see, not just that the organisation was being accepting of the flexible working, but also recognising that you can help fit people for something else and get a lot from them at the time. Those women were loyal to that company because that company was helping them be what they wanted to be. And I thought it was one of the best initiatives I'd seen.
I mean, that seems really interesting to me, to way to surface some narratives and make what might be abstract or something that you can assume about someone and why they're doing X, Y, and Z, and say, well, actually, there's a human story behind this. This is, these are the reasons I'm taking the flexible learning. Probably might dispel some of that dissonance. Any more questions from the floor? There we are, just two more. Yeah, great.
It's just something I think about a lot when we're talking about the modern workplace, that the actual structure of that concept of 9 to 5 in the workday, and that who created that and where did that come from? And it's usually who we would assume is that. And I find this is more flexible for me, but for my job, I work a lot with international employees and clients, and that I sometimes feel that 9 to 5 is actually not friendly when we talk about not only just flexibility in terms of free time and personal time, but also just who we interact with. And I would just kind of love what your thoughts are, and how do you see that changing into the future to even be more inclusive? And it's just kind of throwing it out there, but I think about that a lot too, is the way our workday is structured as well.
Fantastic.
I was speaking to a colleague, an amazing colleague, Liz Marchant at TNF, and she was saying how 10 years ago, when her children were young, it didn't even occur to her to ask her employer at the time for flexibility so she could miss rush hour. She was like, oh, if only I had asked to leave half an hour early and made up that time later in the evening, I'd have stayed with that company for an awful lot longer. But it was the homeward rush hour commute that was ruining my life. And what she wishes she had done is what I do. I work a short day every day and pretty much make up by doing my email triage in the evening. And I didn't really think twice about setting that up with my manager. So I think that notion of 9 to 5 and the boundaries on it have been dissolving.
And Helen, actually, it'd be interesting to bring you on this in terms of the international working with international colleagues, but it was quite interesting in your 9 to 5, and actually it's kind of, in many ways, especially if we're working from the UK, Eurocentric. How do Emerald get around it?
Well, yes, so actually I do have calls quite frequently with, for instance, people in China and people in Australia, and I take those calls outside of the 9 to 5 working hours. And I think many other Emerald staff also do a similar thing. So yeah, we don't. A 9 to 5 day is kind of pretty redundant.
Is it on top of your 9 to 5 or in supplement to? Or
sometimes it ends up being on top of my 9 to 5. Yes. Sometimes I do try and so if I've got a call, I had a call at 9:00 p.m. time, and I did go into work like a little bit later. But most of the time, I think if you get rid of the 9 to 5 mentality, you've only got so many working hours in you, and you're going to be as productive as you're going to be, no matter how many hours you tie that to. So even thinking, oh, I need to work 8 hours today, I don't do that. I think these are the tasks I need to complete today, and these are the things I need to do. So you can really free yourself from that hourly count.
Mm-hmm.
It's not all sunshine and rainbows, though. I was leaving at 3:30 the other day, and somebody said to me, "Oh, nice for you." And I did have to point out I'd started at 7:30, and I had done a complete full day, and I was still felt I was being judged as a part-timer. So
I guess we're back to the resentment point, aren't we? That actually there's still a bit of a dissonance there as to why people are behaving the way they were. Then it seems like maybe a slight lack of trust sometimes in the why. That hopefully, I mean, you were talking about this, Laura, right? Is that you hopefully just trust the people working worldwide that they're doing what they say they're doing, right?
We don't ask people to keep timesheets. We don't monitor their online activity. We just expect them to do what they're supposed to be doing. And if they do that at 3 a.m. on a Sunday, fine. As long as they can be present for booked meetings that we've all arranged and agreed to, I don't really mind.
See, that seems like a very radical idea of a departure from the 9 to 5. Sorry, another question.
So yeah, my comment was literally in those lines. So when you think about flexible work and resentment, you always think that it's because people that work flexibly can also be working long hours if they don't have any other responsibilities, put it that way. So I guess my question is, would there be ways in which you could actually measure how long is people working. So if you're working flexible, you don't really necessarily need to have this difference in people that is using their time effectively for other matters, or people that is just using more hours for the work.
That's a head scratcher. Yeah, absolutely.
Being virtual makes it difficult. People don't want to see what they're doing. You do have that issue of people tending to do a bit more than perhaps they would if they were in an office and there were more set times. That's why I think in a virtual environment the flexibility is imperative, that people do get that time to go and do what they want, and as long as the tasks are covered and you're not monitoring them. I also, I personally check in on people and say, you seem to be here all the time. I'm getting emails from you at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. and during all through the day and this kind of stuff. You need to take a break. I without putting in some kind of system. I don't want to track people, really. I want to trust them, and I want it to work for them. But I do try and keep an eye on, people who are overdoing it.
Femi, I'd be interested to see in your experience with other industries that perhaps, in sort of your varied experience, whether this is just a pervasive thing, that, the flexibility, and sometimes whether people are working maybe too many hours or that. Also, whether anyone else has successfully employed the trust of flexible working.
I'm actually seeing quite a lot of that in academia, the trust around flexible working, people not clocking in. I think the thing is, if you're managing performance effectively, if you're allocating work appropriately, if you're communicating regularly, you don't need to manage the time because you're managing the output. I am seeing the resentment. I'm seeing people making assumptions that this woman is not serious about her career, or this man is not serious about his career because he's elected to work flexibly or what they call part-time, because they do often see it as less. I do see the sort of the resentment of people saying, they're never here, I can't take my holiday at this time, there's that one, and I'm the one who's expected to pick up the unpopular shifts. And I think that is dealt with absolutely by the sorts of suggestions that people have said. And personally, when I'm advising clients, I would encourage them not to try and monitor. I really do not want to get to the day where people are looking to see how long so-and-so's online, because we'll start to devise little mechanisms where we'll put the computer on and put Skype on when we go to the loo, just to show that we're present. So I certainly am not encouraging that. And I'm seeing really good signs, not just in academia, but also I've seen quite a lot of it in the manufacturing, senior management levels, where people are able to go in, do say inspections and stuff, and then the rest of their time they're kind of left to themselves. So
I like the idea of putting Skype on when you go to the loo. It's like the virtual version of your boss doing a whip round and you minimising Minesweeper for 2018.
Just go on and go.
Actually, just to pivot slightly, so maybe moving slightly away from the theme of flexible working, but back to the monitoring aspect, because Femi, you'd mentioned diversity targets was a very useful thing to do as part of your toolkit. I found that the idea of diversity targets is very hard to distinguish for lots of people, that and quotas, and it's hard to socialise the idea. So I'd be interested from all four of you actually to understand whether you've had, what your experience has been in socialising the idea of targets, objectives around diversity.
We're too small to have targets. We're so small, it's really hard to try and do that, so I haven't tried.
I think we also don't have targets. We've made it more embedded in strategy and policy, and to create the right environment rather than setting targets.
Okay.
Yeah. The Women in Publishing group's not in a position to set targets for TNF. Interestingly, people who have commented on our initiative have said, do you have targets?
Right.
But we haven't set those.
Does that sort of maybe mean that is your sense that people would like that, or that it'd be kind of an easier thing to socialise, or do you think you might encounter resistance if in the hypothetical world you did set targets?
It feels in my 10 years in the industry that we're much more data-driven, data-driven decision-making, at least on the surface anyway, and that measurement and targeting is a much more acceptable part of how we do business now.
Yeah, I mean, it seems as well the gender pay gap was it was a bit of a watershed moment for us in the UK. Seeming that, from my limited understanding, the first methodologically consistent way in which we could all see where we are. So it'd be good to bring you here on Femi to expand a little bit about the real utility and that socialising of diversity targets.
I think targets, if you're of a reasonable size, are good practice. I think they incentivise people. I think they give us a way of communicating to our people within our businesses how well we're doing. I think it helps them understand what the organisational goal is. So long as you're really clear that the way that people are expected to meet their targets is by sort of clearing the path rather than making decision, at the decision-making point, favouring a particular group or another. So what we do is make sure that your field's as wide as it possibly can be, that you're facilitating, empowering, supporting people all the way through, and that's the acceptable way of getting to the targets. That's what needs to be communicated within the organisation, not that you just go along looking for some lightly-looking woman and pop her at the top there just for the sake of it. So how you get to meet your targets is as important as meeting your targets.
I liked what you said earlier, Femi, about building targets into managers' incentives. I think that to get people to take something seriously, say diversity of editorial boards, for instance, that I know Shelley will be talking about later, unless you build it into people's incentive programs, it's hard for them in the very, very busy, packed working lives that we now have to spend the time it needs to really achieve that. So that's a slightly different take on the topic.
That's great. Any questions from the floor? Sorry, Shelley.
Yeah, I was just going to ask your thoughts on social background, class, working classness. I think my own view on this is actually, I think we're going backwards. I feel and putting up the drawbridge a lot on younger generations coming up. When I look at the CVs that come across my desk and what people have as they're coming in, they've got all these internships. I see colleagues, anyone who's Russell Group or Oxbridge, they're just guaranteed an interview. And I look at that and know that I would never get an entry-level job into publishing if that was happening to me now. But yeah, I still think I'm quite a good employee and worth having. And so I just wanted your thoughts on that. I know on a personal level what I've tried to do is I very rarely look at the CV because I think those biases are there, and I always look at the covering letter and how that matches what I've been doing, but I don't see that being a consistent approach, or that others think that is a good way. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on how, as an industry, we can actually open up. For example, we have requirements that people have a degree for a role. I don't quite understand. I know they're dealing with academics. I understand the structural reasons why this is, but I don't understand why some roles require a degree when someone's not necessarily had that opportunity, particularly with the debts that people are having to leave university with. And I can see us really bringing up the drawbridge. That's a long question, but I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, certainly the point. Oh.
In the interest of time.
Fantastic, thank you. Laura, it'd be good to hear from you. So you did some blinding of the recruitment. Was it blinding or
Which wasn't blinding. It was really more to do with the advertising process.
Oh, okay, sure.
So it was really more that we tried to take out a lot of that sort of, love people from Oxbridge and please have a PhD for an entry-level job, which clearly isn't a requirement, and just look for skill sets. And we're so focused on that rather than we must have these kind of qualifications, and we'd really like people who went to this university. And that's why we got away from also advertising on like the university job boards, because we'd quite often advertise with those universities that had like publishing MAs and things like that, or that had courses around publishing, as well as people who already existed in the industry. So it was trying to broaden it out and really sort of say, well, who else is out there who's got all these great skills that we would never they would never come across us otherwise. And I think that's part of what you can do. And then with the CV sifting is having a couple of people doing it so that they're not necessarily, and different people as well, so they're not necessarily going to both agree, oh, well, he's got a degree in chemistry, so we must, or we both did chemistry at university, didn't we? So let's get someone with chemistry, shall we? Or something like that. So you've got different experiences of the people looking at the CVs.
Yeah. I mean, the radical approach of not looking at the CV it just seems interesting to me, but I don't know if maybe at Emerald, if you've got any change in the way you've advertised or recruited.
Yes, we have actually, and this is something that HR are talking a lot about, and to know more about it, you perhaps have to ask them, as I don't know all the details. But yes, we have started to change where we put our job adverts, and we've started to change some of the language in the job adverts. And class is actually something that, so we did, in talking about monitoring, it's really important to kind of, we conducted interviews and focus groups, and one of the things that actually came out of that was class as a key issue. So it's definitely something that we're talking about and looking at.
Do you want something practical?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I've talked a lot about the BBC. They're amongst my favourite clients because they do what you tell them to do, and they've got loads of money, and so they can do big things. But I've also seen, on a smaller scale, The Guardian and Metropolitan Police, all of whom have gone for, do a bit of work first. Do a bit of work first and let us see your work. Don't tell us your name, don't put a covering letter on it, don't even attach your CV. Do this, write this, edit this, film that, upload it to here. We will look at it. If it's good, we will see you. And that has got working class people into, not just into apprenticeships, but into some entry-level jobs, which they probably would never have got to. Because at the end of the day, you don't always need a degree, as you've all said, in order to be able to do something. And even just being asked whether you have one or where you went to university can invoke stereotype threat and undermine your performance. So I'm seeing real success with this practical assessment, certainly at entry level, before we even meet you. And when I see your piece of work and I'm so impressed, and then you wander in and you're a tiny woman, I'm impressed, but I know that you can do good work, so my bias is kind of pushed back a little bit.
It's a fantastic practical piece for us. Fiona?
I'd be really interested. I would really like to see our industry have more apprenticeships for post-secondary. So school leavers with A-levels who, for whatever reason, aren't able to access university. Maybe they don't want to. Maybe they can't countenance the debt levels that they would leave with. And I'd also address the elephant in the room, which is generally fairly low salaries within STM publishing industry, as being potentially unattractive for people who have jumped through the barriers and climbed over obstacles that they encountered. I know that junior members of my team who coming into publishing with £60,000 worth of debt, and I see that fire and hunger and ambition in them so much more than was with us 10 years ago. That need, not just a desire, a need to progress quickly in order to make that debt worthwhile from their family's perspective. I don't really have any suggestions though.
The apprenticeship is a good one.
The apprenticeship, yeah, and I'm not actually sure if that many people are taking advantage of apprenticeships within the industry generally. So, I mean, that seems like also a bit of low-hanging fruit to at least investigate as to where we're at. So, sorry, Roger had a question to finish us off, I think, just about.
Great. Just wasn't sure if that was on. So some of us, thank you so much. It's a great discussion. Really, really appreciate hearing from all of you and so many different perspectives. Over the break, some of us were talking about religious diversity as one of the characteristics that were mentioned once or twice. Femi, I think you said in one of your slides we shouldn't bleach manifestations of religion, which I thought was actually an interesting way to phrase it or frame it. But I was also thinking about this logic about, we should bring our true or authentic self to work with us. And I've also been wondering about the limits of that. there are, thinking about examples around religion or politics where one person's expression of their belief system doesn't always, can conflict with what other people want to hear, and how to negotiate some of those kinds of dynamics. So, certainly coming from an American perspective, it was a little bit foreign to me to hear about the extent to which it sounds like you all are comfortable with having religion in the workplace. That's something that leaves me, I'm just speaking personally here, not as an employee, but leaves me feeling a little uncomfortable sometimes. So I wonder if we could reflect a little bit about, bringing the whole self, but also how to negotiate that, or if that should be negotiated, and what your thoughts on both religion and politics. It's not the same issue by any means, but it's not entirely different either. So,
or perhaps any characteristic, and wondering specifically where the perhaps limits are.
Well, I guess what I'm distinguishing is between a characteristic and a belief system.
Sure.
And that you might not share that distinction, but that's what I was trying to get.
That's great to clarify. Thanks. Femi, it seems like a place to start with you.
I did start it. It's my fault. So, if these are the sayings, aren't they? We want our staff to be able to be authentic. We want them to be able to bring their whole selves to work, and we want to have culturally sensitive working environments. Well, you can't have culturally sensitive working environments if you say that people have to leave a big bit of themselves at the door. You can't do that. But I think what goes wrong sometimes is you go, right, okay, we're completely inclusive, and then, of course, you get a clash. The early ones I used to see all the time was people with a strong faith, and then we have to protect people on the basis of their sexual orientation. And then that was the early ones that I used to see a lot. And what goes wrong is that people think that they can't place any restrictions on someone when they say you can manifest your religion. What we mean is you can manifest yourself respectfully. And we support your right to be all that you are, up until the point what you are violates the rights of others. And at that point you start to lose the protection. So you can't proselytise in the workplace because that might make people feel uncomfortable, but you can wear your little gold cross. And if everyone in the office is fine about there being a Star of David or a Christmas tree or something like that in the office, then that's usually acceptable. And we do think about the times that we hold our meetings, and we do think about, where we're catering and whether that's comfortable for people who are fasting, and when we're having, when people have to take exams and other assessment things. That's the sort of stuff I've seen working quite well.
If anyone's had any particular experience in there, I mean, it does seem like it will continue to be a thing that we're going to have to grapple at, and it seems almost like case by case to understand the how we can express dignity to everyone, but also not infringe upon someone else's dignity or respect. So, I mean, unfortunately, I think probably like society at large, it's going to be a thing that we're going to just have to be constantly mindful of, right?
But you can't do it well if you haven't created a culture where everyone can speak easily, freely, and do it from a position. There has to be an assumption of good intent. If you start with an assumption of good intent, then if people feel that they need to negotiate, that's easier to do. So you want these environments where you know that people are committed to working together well, and then that makes it possible.
And in those flashpoints, the point you made in your talk about the perhaps that aftercare of that person that may have infringed in these particular scenarios where it's tension might help foster that, right? Exactly. That it's not. It's open for all, and hopefully we all can, as sort of rainbow and sunshines and sound, grow together. So I think that kind of brings us to time. We might be slightly over, but thank you very much for our panellists. Give you a little round of applause for them. Themselves. Thank you all for the great questions.